Of all the various expressions of slavery and of freedom, one of the ways which we find is that the Jews are described as anusa pia dibur, which for these purposes means that the Jews in a sense were forced when it came to speaking. This is not the literal interpretation and not even the contextual interpretation, but there may be a very deep idea behind it. When the Jews were slaves, what this is trying to say, they had lost their voices. They lost the ability to speak. In order to understand this, we need to go back to creation. When man is created, we're told that God endowed man with an ability to speak. In a certain sense, that's what makes us different from all the other animals, from all the other creation. We have the ability of saying things, of saying ideas, saying emotions, of putting them to words and sentences and paragraphs. We have the ability of saying things and expressing ideas. When the Egyptians turned us into slaves, we began to believe that we were slaves. When they looked at us as being, in a sense, as subhuman, we seemed to have accepted their descriptions of us, and we became subhuman in the sense that we lost our collective voices. We lost the ability to speak. We lost the ability to express ourselves. So according to the same line of thinking, Pesach, therefore, is another way of saying pa, or pe-sach. Now the mouth was able to speak, which means that one of the things that happened as we left is we suddenly found our voice. We were able to say things, to speak, to enunciate. No place is this clearer than when we get to the sea. When we look through all of the various plagues that took place in Egypt, we don't really see a response from the Jews to this. The main struggle is between God and Paro, as it were, or really it looks like God's proxies, Moshe and Aaron. The Jewish people are on the side. They're who are spoken about. They're the subject, in a sense. But when they leave, and when they stand at the sea, and we see the miracle which took place, then, with the lead of Moshe, they find their voices and they begin to sing. They say the Az Yashir and they say thank you. They say praise for God. They see glimpses of the future. In a certain sense, this is the culmination of leaving Egypt, when the Jews have their voice again. Unfortunately, as we travel through this week's parsha, through Beshalach, we come to the realization that becoming free is not just a sudden event that takes place. It's one that, for every time we go forward, there seems to be setbacks as well. This voice which they found, the ability to say thank you, turns, unfortunately, into complaints as we continue. As we proceed, 3 days later, the water is bitter and they complain. Did it occur to them that the same God that turned the Nile into blood can also turn anything into water, certainly bitter water into sweet water? They need to see that. But unfortunately, even when they see it, they don't seem to say thank you. And afterwards, they get to the next stage where they're searching for food. And they complain and they say, perhaps we should have died in Egypt. And then God opens up the heavens and gives them bread from heaven. And as they continue, we keep finding this lack of saying thank you, this lack of appreciation, but rather the complaints are now what they're speaking about. When they get to the next stop where there again is a problem with water, once again we find the complaints. And again, Moshe is here told to take the stick and to hit the rock, and water appears, but no thank you is there. Instead, they again challenge God. Is God among us? It's unbelievable and just incredible cognitive dissonance. That morning for breakfast, they had manna from heaven. And nonetheless, at this point, they're questioning God's existence. At that moment, Amalek appears. And there's something very deep about this. Amalek are the descendants of Esav. Esav is the one who had sold his birthright to Yaakov. And because of that, we were the ones who went down to become slaves. We were the ones who took responsibility for the covenant between God and Abraham. Now that the slavery was completed, Amalek appears, ready to kill us if they can, and to take their inheritance and to go and take the land of Israel. But we need to be very, very careful. In the book of Dvarim, when it talks about the battle with Amalek, it says that at that point they came and attacked us when we were tired. So if we now begin to think about it, instead of saying thank you, instead of praying, instead of saying praise, we've become a people who are tired, and we become a people who are talking about death. When Yaakov and Esav, all those years ago, sat down and made their deal, Esav had come in from the field, And Esav said, I'm tired. At that point, Yaakov said, if you're tired, you're not willing to live up to your responsibility, I'll take the responsibility and I'll take the birthright. And Esav's response was, I'm going to die. What do I need it for? If we're very, very careful, we notice that the Jewish people have now begun to sound like Esav. They're tired. They're not using the call of Yaakov, the voice of Yaakov, to pray and to say thank you. Rather, they're complaining and saying, we're going to die. Well, we should have died in Egypt. It's at this point that Moshe needs to go into a two-stage plan. On the one hand, he needs to fight with Amalek, and he sends Yoshua with the sword, and that is the utensil of Amalek. On the other hand, Moshe goes up to the mountain together with Aaron and with Hur. And Moshe lifts his hands, as it were, in prayer. He lifts his hands up, and as he lifts his hands, he's showing that hands should be used not for battle, but to point up to heaven. And as he points up to heaven, the people lift their heads up, and they begin to pray again. And once we find our voice again, we can be victorious. Once we find our voice again, we can continue our march to Sinai. We continue our march to the land of Israel. When we find our voice again, we deserve to have that wonderful rendezvous with God and receive the Torah.